Symposium. My name is Catherine Workman, and I am the Senior Director of Wildlife Grant Making here at the National Geographic Society. At National Geographic, we invest in bold people and transformative ideas in order to enact positive change for our planet. But how do you identify an idea that is transformative? How do you work to anticipate and encourage innovative ideas that approach challenges in ways that have never been attempted? Our team thinks about those questions every day so that we can craft our funding opportunities in a way that allows scientists and explorers to look at problems from different angles and with new perspectives. That's why I'm excited to be introducing our second session, which focuses on designing a systems approach. This session will dive into the intricacies and dynamics of systems thinking and explore how to apply systems theory to catalyze change. Our speakers will examine both quantitative and qualitative methods for creating these systems-level changes. Before we get started with this session, I would like again to encourage everyone online, and for those of you who are here in the room, to join the conversation via Twitter. Engage with us by tweeting your thoughts and questions using the symposium hashtag WWF2. And now, let me introduce our first speaker, Dan McClure, the Principal Innovation Choreographer of Practical Clarity, LLC. Practical Clarity specializes in hands-on applications of systems thinking and complex innovation methodologies to solve hard problems and take advantage of big opportunities. Dan is a practitioner theorist of systems innovation, developing and applying new innovation methodologies based on over 3 decades of hands-on work with complex systems transformations. His work focuses on messy problem spaces where traditional innovation methodologies prove to be too limited, such as creating collaborative ecosystems that extend the potential of non-market-based environmental programs, disrupting humanitarian aid systems based on rigid 20th century supply chain management, and broadly restructuring innovation capabilities in sectors with complex unsolved problems. Previously, Dan worked as the innovation design lead at ThoughtWorks, where he led the ground-up development of a new business innovation practice. Please join me in welcoming Dan McClure.
Well, hello. So is anybody else feeling like, boy, this system stuff is kind of complex, and it might take a little while to wrap my mind around that? Well, to be honest with you, I think it's in many ways both easier and harder than it seems right now. In one way, it's easier because we've all been thinking systems our entire life. There's no way that you could be here today and not be somebody who thinks about systems. On the other hand, this system stuff, it gets really weird sometimes. So what I'd like to do is walk you through the toolkit of systems and show you some of the straightforward things and some of the weird stuff and give you a little idea of just the entire range of possibilities that you have to work with. All right, so let's start with a fairly simple challenge. I simply want to understand the way my world works. And we'll do this with an example of a woman who's a fisherwoman. She has a boat. She uses the boat to harvest fish. She takes the fish, she sells them in a restaurant, she makes money, she supports her family, and she has money to take the boat out again. This is a really straightforward system, and even if she doesn't officially think in terms of systems, chances are she understands how this works. So Peter Senge called this the reinforcing loop of a business. This is the business as usual. And this is where people go when they see that something's gone wrong. They go to their basic reinforcing loop and they try to figure out how to fix it. So let's say she begins to note that there's fewer fish. She's going to use this reinforcing loop, this model of her business, and say, fewer fish, I need a better boat. So I've got more and better boats now. I've increased my yield back to where it was. Everything's good. Oops, there's even fewer fish now. Now, what Senge basically offers us is a simple tool to say, in addition to looking at this reinforcing model of the way you normally think about your business, look at one loop out of the thing that constrains your business. So in this particular case, the constraint is the ecosystem that's being depleted of fish. So now she has the opportunity to see not one lever, more boats, but to see multiple levers, possibly more boats, but she has an entire another system that she can go and work with about possibly increasing the stocks of fish, fishing in ways that preserve the ecosystem in a better way. So through just simple additions of system models, she's able to conceive of a broader set of opportunities. So at the simple level, there's a lot that can be done by just expanding the number of systems that we look at. Now, you might ask, could we do more than that, being greedy that we are? And we might say, what if I had lots more data? What if I had lots of information about the system? Could I do more than simply just look at one change for myself? And the answer is, yes, you can. You'll just have a diagram that looks something like this, which is the political state of Afghanistan. The New York Times made huge fun of this, but the truth is, this is a pretty good model. It explains the complexities of a very complex space, and it's not going to take very long before you're going to want to have yourself a computer system, because it's going to be hard to do this one by hand. So you start throwing these things into the computer systems, and you can answer questions like, if I poke this part of the system, how will this part of the system react? Or if I make this type of connection, how might other connections be affected? So these computer systems can begin to help us understand what the impact of changes within these systems are. Might we be able to be like an Isaac Asimov and predict the entire future if we had just a good enough system? Well, that's what a guy named Lorenz thought when he was looking at weather prediction. And he said, you know, if I can just model enough of the pieces of this complex system of weather, I'll be able to tell you whether it's going to rain in Houston or not. And what he found is that his starting conditions would produce a certain result. And after a while, he'd make a small change to his starting conditions, and you'd get a small change in the result. And then he'd run it again, and all of a sudden, that small change in the starting conditions produced a huge change in the result. And this is what you call a chaotic system. So nonlinear systems with feedback loops on it have this behavior that you can get radically different outcomes as the result of just a small change to the inputs. So now this is sort of a limit to our hubris of how far we think we can actually calculate perfectly the future, because we know that as we make these small changes to starting conditions, the possible outcomes are radically different. Now that doesn't mean that the whole pattern is completely unconstrained. It just means that for any particular time, you're going to possibly see variations that you don't exist. This is the source of a metaphor that says, if I have a butterfly flapping in Brazil, I can possibly have a hurricane happening in Houston. The small change of the butterfly wings possibly drives bigger changes through these chaotic effects. Well, that's pretty strange. I mean, that's not the way the normal world works. If I poke something a little bit, I expect it to go just a little bit. Unless, of course, you've got a little sister, in which case, if you poke her a little bit, she might go, you know, might be bizarre. But that's not the limits to strangeness in systems. So there's some really cool, strange stuff that happens with systems that's pretty powerful. One is the idea of emergent properties. So if you ever look up at a flock of geese or a flock of birds, you see them all moving in concert with one another. Turns out there's no one leading. There's no one in charge of that very complex behavior. Instead, what it is small behaviors all working together produce what they call an emergent behavior of the system. And this is a really powerful concept when you think about the possibility of a system having big, powerful emergent behaviors without actually having to have somebody in charge of it. So this is one concept, is that you can have emergent behaviors. Another one of those sort of strange concepts is the idea of fractal and similarity based on size. So what a fractal basically claims is that the way something looks in a small form is very similar to the way something looks in a large form. And as a result, if you, for example, look at the coastline along here, you'll see that it's jagged in the same way if you look at a satellite picture or if you look at a picture of just very close to the coastline. This idea of similarity across systems allows you to do some really amazing predictions. So for example, Jeffrey West basically just put out a book where he explains why cats have shorter lifespans but more heartbeats per minute than an elephant, but they're actually proportional to one another. So you can begin to take very different systems and see similarities using some of these advanced mathematics concepts. You probably don't want to do that before breakfast, however. So let's take a look at some things that are maybe more within our everyday reach. Let's try game playing. So if you take the idea of machines and systems, you're going to be able to basically replicate the exact same behaviors, and the machine's going to do exactly what you tell it to do. One of the things that people began to realize in the 20th century was that the systems that included people in them had very different behaviors. And so a system that has individual actors who are all independent of one another will have strategies for how those actors interact. And this was generally called game theory. So John von Neumann proposed this as early as the 1920s, and it was made relatively famous by the movie The Beautiful Mind, A Beautiful Mind. But it's all basically the idea that incentives and the rules of the game have a big impact on the way that systems work. So that you can't simply say, how did I connect up the parts like a clock? You have to say, how did I connect up the parts, and what are the incentives of all the different actors? So we begin to see that the design of a system is more complex. And it comes up with my favorite phrase, which is, if you're going to design a system in which everybody's going to collaborate, you need to make sure that everybody gets a pony. You can't have a system in which one person grants to the rest of the group that they're going to do something with no reward. Everybody needs to get a reward. And you think about that, that really puts a lot of pressure on a system designer, because now we need to, as a result of that, think about how we architect systems where everybody is being paid off in a way, in a coin that they value. So now we begin to look at systems that look like this, that have lots of connections, lots of different resources coming in, but also have lots of different rewards associated with them. And that's the kind of complex system that Benny was talking about when he talks about, we need to build these complex systems that fit in that corner of the Conifin model. So let's take a look at an example of how shifting rewards can shift the success of a system. Let's say we have a poaching strategy that basically says, if we catch you poaching, we're going to punish you, but if you get away with it, you get to sell the ivory. So now that person basically has a win and a loss, and it really depends on how often they get caught as to how the math works out for them. Let's try a different strategy. Now let's remove the ivory market. Now they have nowhere to sell the ivory. There is no profit for the poaching, and there's just a downside. Which strategy is going to be more likely to work? We didn't actually do anything to the poacher themselves. We simply changed the system that they worked within. And we shifted the incentives within that system. And as a result, the ivory market strategies are actually having a lot of impact. All right. Now, we've all been talking about more complex problems. And one of the things that's exciting about systems is not only do you get to look at basically complex problems, but you get to look at complex solutions. So before we get there, we really need to understand a little bit about what these complex problems are. Both of our prior speakers have talked about that a little bit, but it's worth talking a moment or two about how we got here. In the 60s and 70s, as computer power began to build up, the optimism that we would be able to calculate exactly the best solution for urban design, the best solution for urban poverty, began to be sort of a dream that was sitting in people's gut. And unfortunately, what we discovered was the challenges associated with making a really complex system meant that the watchmaker was dead. The ability to build a fixed, complicated system that could exactly predict the results, the best possible outcomes, we couldn't use that to design systems. So instead, we're left with the wicked problems that were Churchman, Weber, Eckhoff all described and have been summarized really very nicely by Banny about big problem spaces, multiple actors, multiple incentives. And they require us to solve not simply the problems of interaction, not simply the problems of incentives, but all of this stuff together. So we've already mentioned on how the SDGs are difficult. Remember that the SDGs, even though they finally include environmental programs, also include other SDGs that appear to be in conflict with those environmental goals. Some of them are just darn hard problems like urban poverty and urban transformation. And thank you, Banny, for stealing my joke. It is even the holiday dinner that is a difficult sort of thing. So everybody laugh for a moment. Ha 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 ha. Thank you. That was supposed to be your moment of levity in this. So the question is if we've got this big, ugly, wicked problems, are we really left with no answer? And the answer to that is thankfully no. There's a lot of ways to transform systems. So Donella Meadows had a lot of negative views on the challenges that were out there, but one of the things she pointed out that if we're going to be realistic about actually going and taking on these problems, we have to recognize that they're difficult, that they're transitory, and that they're constantly in change. So we don't get to go and fix the system and then go off and have a well-deserved beer. Instead, we're going to be continually engaging with systems change. And that, I would say, is the current state of the practice, is the systems that we're working with are essentially continually evolving over time. So unlike a single change of a law or the introduction of a technical product, what we see is that we're working with complex systems in the world and that we continue to work with them. And this is a big shift in thinking because it basically means that we have to have stewardship over the shape of systems on an ongoing basis, even once we think we've gotten to a good spot. Because the spot's going to move, the system's going to move, the incentives are all going to move. And so we need practices that allow us to keep moving forward on that. Donella Meadows called it dancing with systems. I call it the role of choreographer. I think Banny called it the idea of systems leadership. But we need new focus on people who actually understand how the big picture works, and we need to encourage that role within organizations. That role basically shifts from top-down command and control, we're planning everything out, to one of continual learning and adjustment as we're going along. And this is a big shift for most organizations, because most organizations, even if they say they want dynamic change according to a plan that'll be delivered next November. So this adaptive loop basically can be applied in a lot of ways. It's applied in lean startup for agile, but it can be applied to much bigger problems in the case of adaptive and big complex systems. So instead of imagining a project that goes along step by step, we imagine one where we make a change in a system, then we check. We make another change in a system, We check. And we continue to evolve this rather than seeing it as a big change that happens all at once. Let's imagine we're doing a garden. I love gardens because it's like you're doing creation with God. So you start with a path and a tree. And you say, did that work? Okay, good. We're going to add some bushes and a flower. You go to the next time. You didn't pull out the tree. You didn't get rid of the path. But you might pull out the bush and add some extra flowers. And so you're constantly evolving this system where all the pieces are working together. So we need to think about like ourselves as systems gardeners and develop techniques and tools around that. So this brings us to some of the tool makers. So we've talked about some of the things about systems themselves, their crazy chaotic nature, their ability to be modeled through certain technologies. There's a whole set of tools that are being developed around the support of this systems leadership. And I'm just going to really quickly tick off a few of those for you. One is reimagining what expertise is about. So expertise in the classic model is, I know the answer because I'm really smart. And I can tell you the answer just to any question you might ask. The new definition of expertise is around the idea of I know what the system should look like, and I can look at that system and tell you whether or not it's looking the way it should. This is really what firefighters use when they're assessing. And Gary Klein, with his work on naturalistic decision-making, really points out that this sort of view of expertise shifts to one of understanding the way the system should look from knowing facts about things. There's a new role for telling visual stories. Now, you'll notice in a lot of Manny's examples and the earlier examples around ecosystems, there are always pictures. Telling visual stories is a key skill when it comes to this particular type of journey. So Daniel Burnham, the weaker half of my favorite quote is, make big plans, aim high, and hope and work, remembering that a noble logical diagram will not die. A great diagram is a great thing for driving systems because it allows you to see how the pictures work. So here's another new skill then that we need to support and encourage, and that was picked up later on in the urban architecture space and the pattern design work of Christopher Alexander. Now, it's all well and good to say, I'm going to build this big new idea, but we also need to be able to change it as we go along. I pulled out a bush in my last example. What MIT is looking at is how do we actually create Legos of system creation? So how do we build systems through Legos that you can put together in different ways rather than things that are fixed and locked in place? And finally, there's entire business methodologies that need to be built around this, such as Agile, which are all around the business processes that support these. So we have a lot of stuff to possibly draw on, a lot of things that we can do. I would encourage you to embrace both the easy stuff and the hard stuff because the world is filled with systems and we need to get good at doing them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker realized early in life that she can't possibly do all of the good the world needs, but that the world needs all the good that she can do. Andi Sharma is a senior analyst for the government of Manitoba's Northern Healthy Foods Initiative, an award-winning program designed to develop localized, holistic, and healthy food systems that are culturally relevant in Canada's far north. Andi directs a variety of stakeholder interests and funding towards helping northern communities regain control over their food system, ensuring that all Manitobans' right to healthy food is protected. She has spent the last 5 years as a practitioner of collective impact and systemic change, integrating the food sovereignty movement in the far reaches of Canada's Northlands. Recently, Andi earned her pilot's license to fly food north herself, fueled by her deep passion and commitment for providing food supplies to remote locations. Please welcome Andi Sharma.
I'm here to talk about something we are all after. It doesn't matter whether you're a conservation scientist working on the front lines or a bureaucrat developing public policy. There's one thing that drives us to do what we do. It's why we get up in the morning, and it's definitely what keeps me up at night. We've all spent countless hours, or for some of us, our entire lives have been spent chasing systemic change. I work in the food security sector, and despite the fact that globally we already produce enough food to feed 2.5 billion more people than exist on the planet today, we continue to see hunger on every street corner of every city in every country of this world. Now, those of us in the field all have our own processes, our own tools, our own budgets, and there are thousands of us around the globe working on the same issue. So the question has to become, why is it that even though we are expending an incredible amount of human and fiscal resources to achieve the same goal, that we've seen little traction and less progress? And when trying to answer this question, we have to take a step back, look at the process. What's currently being done, and why isn't it working? Well, social researchers Kanye and Kramer out of Stanford University did exactly that, and they found something really interesting. They found that the social and environmental justice sectors are designed for incentivizing isolated impact. And to understand what they mean by that, we have to follow the money. Most funders, having to choose from many applicants, try to determine which organizations make the greatest contribution towards solving a particular social problem, like food insecurity. So right from the start of this process, we're trying to tackle a complex system by identifying and supporting isolated solutions and individual actors. Now, in turn, grantees compete to be chosen by emphasizing how their individual activities can produce the greatest effect, irrespective of the numerous other organizations that also influence the issue. Add to the problem an apathetic and disengaged private sector. I mean, we all know that the primary directive of the conventional private sector, writ large, is focused solely on financial bottom lines and largely unconcerned about their impact or contribution to perpetuating environmental degradation, social marginalization. And the scientific community is also isolated. I mean, how many of us have written academic articles for scientific journals that have been read by 12 people at best? Likely none of whom are actually delivering frontline programming. Public policy is usually crafted in isolation as well by politicians and bureaucrats not versed in the scientific research because they're not reading our articles in those journals. And instead, they're driven by media and electoral cycles, which inevitably translates into short-term fixes to long-term problems. And then everybody is asked to evaluate the impact of their programming, and every attempt is made to isolate that stakeholder's individual influence from all other variables. So right now, the system is desperately trying to find a solution within one organization while hoping that the most effective interventions will replicate and extend their impact. It's like we're trying to find a cure for food insecurity, and we're convinced that there's only one formula that's going to work. As a result of this process, the nearly 1.4 million nonprofits currently operating in Canada all invent independent solutions to major social problems, often working at odds with each other, thereby artificially increasing the perceived resources required to make meaningful progress. Now, this seems pretty straightforward, but I want to share a story that really illustrates the concept and drives home why it's so problematic. Let me tell you about a little girl named Sarah. Sarah was a straight-A student in my hometown's inner city. She always showed up and she was always happy to be there. One day, her marks started dropping and she started skipping classes. So Sarah's teacher reached out to her parents. She couldn't get a hold of them, which is a fairly common occurrence in inner-city school districts. So instead, she sat down with Sarah and asked her, "What's going on, kid?" And Sarah's in grade 6. So to the best of her ability, she says she hasn't been eating well and she's been feeling sick. So her teacher enrolled her in the local nonprofit's healthy food program, which meant that she had breakfasts, snacks, and healthy lunches provided for her. Problem solved, right? Well, Sarah's grades kept falling and her absences continued to grow until eventually she dropped out of school entirely that year. She's in grade 6. What Sarah's teacher couldn't possibly have known was that Sarah needed so much more than healthy food. There were many service agencies in the community that each had their own piece of her heartbreaking story. Unemployment agencies knew that neither parent was currently working. Family violence agencies knew that her father had a known history of domestic abuse. Police knew that Sarah had been picked up for being drunk early in the year, and her father was a known gang member. Addictions agencies were well acquainted with both mom and dad and noted that neither of them were attending programming. And the hospital knew that Sarah's mom had just had a child, and Sarah's school counselor knew that Sarah was the one taking care of the baby. Now, this is exactly what is meant by isolated impact. All of these agencies had at one point made contact and provided a service to this family, but the lack of integration makes it extremely difficult for them to achieve the objectives that they were striving for individually. So while the parents were in rehab, they weren't necessarily ensuring that the kids had access to healthy food, or when they were working and had access to more money, they weren't attending their addictions programming. Now, the problem only magnifies at the systemic level. And despite this being the main approach, there's very little evidence that isolated initiatives are the best way to tackle complex social problems. So, how do we tackle entire systems that operate under historical imperatives driven by the sheer inertia and momentum of we've always done it this way? Well, the reality is, if we want systemic change, we need systemic processes. So, enter the theory of collective impact systems. It's a concept that I borrowed from practitioners in the southern US education sector and applied to the northern Manitoba food security sector. The model is elegant in its simplicity, at the core of which is a commitment from a group of key stakeholders from different sectors to a common agenda for solving a specific social problem. I know what you're thinking. Collaboration is nothing new, and you're right. But collective impact systems are distinctly different due to their organizational structure and the unique ability of that structure to achieve better outcomes. Let's return to Sarah's story. Collective impact systems are specifically designed to work within the context of these complex and nuanced social circumstances. Their very architecture draws on the strength of that interconnectedness and channels it towards finding holistic solutions from a variety of angles. All of the service providers were called around one table, and in this way, the collective impact system allowed for a more complete picture of Sarah's story. And the resources around the table were better redeployed to help stabilize her family. So the police removed the father from the home due to the charges of domestic violence, and he was enrolled in anger management programming. Family services intervened and changed the locks on the home to secure the living conditions for the mom and the kids. Addictions agencies set up programming for both parents. In-home support care was provided to assist mom with the new baby, and the local inner-city social enterprise was enlisted to provide employment and training for the father to help him rebuild his life after gang involvement. Now, after a few months of this sustained campaign of intervention, the stability in Sarah's life dramatically improved, so much so that she went back to school and her grades went back to normal. And just as an aside, this case study is from about 7 years ago, and Sarah has since graduated from high school and she's attending university, and she's the first in her family to do that. Now, this example highlights the individual level, but the beautiful part of this model is its ability to scale up. Imagine what good we could do if all the world Sarahs didn't fall through the cracks. And that's what we're trying to do up above the 51st parallel, where due to the continuing legacy of colonialism and institutionalized racism, Indigenous communities no longer have sovereignty over their food systems. And in fact, their traditional practices of harvesting from the land were brutally interrupted by violently forced assimilation through the residential schools. Now, today, this manifests as 1 in 4 Indigenous peoples across Canada are considered severely food insecure, and that number jumps to 2 in 3 for Indigenous children. And you can understand why when it costs people in the North $20 for a head of lettuce, or over $100 for a couple of jugs of clean drinking water. And these communities also face extreme poverty, with over 80% of some communities living on income assistance. The situation is it's untenable. Manitoba also has the dubious honor of leading the country for type 2 diabetes in children, and we heard about childhood obesity in one of the earlier talks. And I'll never forget the first time that I saw the reality of that particular statistic. It was on one of my first trips up north, and I was coming out of the northern store, and I saw just a baby, really, couldn't have been more than 2 years old, drinking Pepsi from his milk bottle because it's cheaper than milk up there. So our collective impact system brings together stakeholders from all across the country, spanning private, public, and third sector organizations to try to make sure that that doesn't have to happen anymore. How does it work? Well, the model is predicated on 5 structural elements and 3 necessary preconditions. And the first thing people always ask is, how can we afford this? So as you would expect, the first precondition for collective impact is ensuring that you have adequate resources at play. And this is the most interesting part of the model for me because it's not looking for more resources to be expended. It's calling to look at the resources already in play and reorienting it from an isolated impact to a more coordinated design. And just like in Sarah's story, our collective impact system pooled resources from existing initiatives, and from that pooled resource base, a percentage was dedicated to administrating the system. Now, for any type of collaborative change to get traction, the issue being tackled has to be perceived as important or urgent to the community. And this can be challenging because there are often too many competing issues for the community to rally around just one, but when you consider that Indigenous peoples in Northern Canada face food insecurity at a rate 6 times the national average, which incidentally is the highest documented rate for any population in a developed country, that kind of urgency is unmistakable. The third and final precondition is finding and engaging influential leadership. Now, these champions bring with them a number of strategic assets, including a sphere of influence that can be tapped for resources and connections to broaden the network and lend credibility to the effort. For our system, one of the founding partners was the provincial government, and so we benefited from the power and influence that comes with ministerial leadership and the weight of office behind it. And this isn't always easy, and some initiatives have been hijacked by their influential leaders, but in our experience, it has been foundational to our success. Importantly, collective impact requires all participants to have a shared vision for change, and that has to include a common understanding of the problem and a joint approach to solving it. And when you're working with such a diverse group of stakeholder interests, it can be really difficult to find alignment, but it is possible. I remember one time around our table, the situation came up where a more environmentally focused organization had serious concerns about funding projects that supported harvesting and hunting caribou for traditional foods. And caribou herds have suffered from the deleterious effects of climate change, and some herds are considered at risk in Manitoba. After hours of rich conversation over many, many months, this tension was finally relieved by creating an understanding that Indigenous hunters have stewarded the caribou populations for millennia, and they have the knowledge in the communities to ensure their safety. Almost 7 years on from this particular project, and the herd is in recovery and on its way back to running normally. Developing a shared measurement system was even more difficult, but it is absolutely necessary for collective impact. It's an iterative process, so we're still working on it to this day. It's a delicate dance, balancing such varied stakeholder needs, but agreement on a common agenda is absolutely illusory without agreement on the ways that success will be measured and reported. I think the most time-consuming aspect of the process is developing trust among the people at the table, and that can only happen through continuous communication. Our collective impact system is unique insofar as it not only invites nonprofits, government agencies, corporations to the table, but importantly, we have community members with lived experience as part of the discussion. Collective impact necessarily brings all of these stakeholders together in an attempt to move from independently operating groups to shared planning and activities that work in concert together. And in doing so, there are many competing interests and sometimes very deeply held mistrusts that need to be reconciled. So far, we've managed to overcome these obstacles through mechanisms like our learning trips, where we spend over a week living up in community, out on the land, and learning each other's stories, really humanizing the process. It is remarkable what sharing a meal with somebody can accomplish. It's a beautiful practice that has this uncanny ability to shift power dynamics and foster open and honest communication. We've been building relationships over food for years now, and there's an easy trust among the group, and it really reinforces the work that we do. And of course, none of this would be possible without the defining feature of this model. Implementing collective impact requires a dedicated staff to serve as the backbone for the entire initiative. The expectation that collaboration can occur without a supporting infrastructure is one of the most common reasons why it fails. Our backbone is hosted by Tides Canada Foundation. Now, they support the initiative through ongoing facilitation, data collection, reporting, handling the myriad logistical details that are required for the initiative to function smoothly. It isn't always possible to have a dedicated organization to fill this role. In fact, our model was recently replicated in the Northwest Territories, and what they've done is each partner provides organizational time in equal measure to fulfill that function. So the model's adaptability is really a key to its sustainability. There are also 5 phases to the development of a collective impact system, and we are currently nestled in the 5th stage. And over all the years it's taken us to get to that stage, we found that the model is far from perfect. There are a lot of issues with things like power dynamics, equity, oversimplification, and the use of collective voice, for example. But so far, it seems to be gaining significant ground for us in the North. Among all of the members and over the life of the collaborative, we've seen millions of pounds of fresh, healthy meats, fruits, and vegetables grown in the North. We've grown from a small $50,000 budget to millions in just 5 years. And that allows us to deepen our impact and extend our reach. A major component of long-term sustainability is community-level skill development, and thanks to our collective efforts, we've been able to deliver at least one educational event in the last 5 years per day. We've created tens of jobs and hundreds of mentorship opportunities. And it's slow going, but we're pretty happy with where we've come. And I'll be honest, this is a lot slower and messier than simply funding a compelling grant request from one organization, but if we are patient and we give time for the magic to happen, that's when we can turn the impossible into the inevitable. Thanks.
Very compelling. Thank you, Andi. Our next speaker is Paolo Gaudiano of Aleria. Excuse me, Paolo. Paolo founded Aleria and serves as CEO. He also serves as the Executive Director of Quantitative Studies of Diversity and Inclusion at the City College of New York. Paolo has 3 decades worth of expertise and experience in business, technology, and academia. He has worked over these years to combine his skills and expertise to revolutionize how corporations think about diversity and what they can do about it. Ultimately, his work has focused on how we can make our societies more inclusive. He has also spent the last 2 decades working to solve complex business and technology problems for leading private and public entities at Ecosystem, where he is currently the Chief Technology Officer. Paolo is a frequent public speaker. He's given a TEDx talk and has written for several media outlets. He is currently a Forbes contributor on the complexity of diversity. Without further ado, please welcome Paolo Gaudiano.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everybody. And do I have this mic on? I'm going to walk around a little bit. It's great to be here. It's a real pleasure. Eric Bonobo was supposed to be here. Eric is a dear friend. I've known him since 1990 or so, and we've worked together for almost 20 years, but unfortunately he had a family emergency. Luckily, I know things maybe even slightly better than he does. But I'm going to talk about, and it's a great excuse because I get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is about diversity and inclusion toward the end of the presentation. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually riff on some of the things that you've heard from prior speakers about complexity. And in particular, the title of my talk refers to the idea that when you look at systems, and we already had an example from Dan of geese flying in a V formation, oftentimes what you see at the system level is very different from what you would expect from the individuals. In other words, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This is actually a picture from National Geographic, was one of the pictures of the year, showing a shark moving through a school of fish. And the fish move around like a single organism. And yet, they're not using Twitter, they're not using Slack. How do they do it, right? And that's what Dan referred to as this notion of emergent behaviors. So an emergent behavior is something that is coming out of a system as a result of the individuals all behaving and interacting with one another in ways that is often not very naturally easy to understand. In case you think this only happens in nature, in fact, it also happens in human-made systems like the stock market. Or, for example, in sports. Why do certain teams win? I'm from Boston, so I couldn't help but show the Sox winning the World Series. Now, not all of these outcomes are positive. Often we get these unintended outcomes that can have very negative consequences. And as an example that we're all familiar with, and we heard Linda talk about it earlier, is traffic. Everybody on that road is trying to do the same thing. They're trying to get to work or wherever they're going as fast as possible. But the unintended emergent behavior is that they're all stuck on the highway. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to go cause a traffic jam. Now, there are a few things that I want to tell you about complex systems and emergent behaviors that are not obvious. The first one is that a system does not need to be complicated in order to be complex. And I'm actually going to give you a demonstration that requires a little bit of crowd participation. So what I'm going to ask you is I need about 10 people up here, and I'm going to suggest those people, maybe the 5 aisle people here, and if I can get a few aisle people here to just come up and join me on stage. We're going to play a very quick game, but I need your collaboration because otherwise we're going to get stuck and not have the talk. Andi, you can come up too. You've already been on the stage. You're familiar with it. Can I get a few people, please? Okay, maybe we can get a couple of the volunteers up there. Come on up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is while the people are gathering on the stage, I think this is good, perfect, this will be good. So I'm going to play a very simple game that is going to look like this. I'm going to ask each of you to look around the room, or look around the stage, not around the room, and focus on two people. Don't tell them who they are. Just think of two people. And what you're going to do, like is depicted here. So there's you, right? You don't have to be wearing a tuxedo. And you're going to choose two people. One person is the aggressor, and one person is the defender. And then your goal is going to be to move in such a way that you're letting the defender protect you from the aggressor. In other words, let's say, for example, that I choose you as my defender and Andi as the very aggressive person coming at me with a pilot license. What I would do when I say go is I'm going to move like this so that she cannot see me because you're blocking my way. Okay, so look at two people. You don't have to tell them who they are. One is the aggressor, one is the defender. And when I say go, I want you to move in such a way that the defender is blocking you from the aggressor. You ready? Okay, let's do it. Okay, good. All right. Let's stop that for a second. Okay, so you pass. Nobody died. You're all still alive. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to play the same game, but I'm going to make it, let's spread out a little bit more. And let's play the same game, but with a slight change. So same thing as before. You are still you. But now what we're going to do is that you're going to choose two people, but this time you are the defender. So let's say that I did the same thing, right? So in this case, Andi is now the person that I'm trying to defend, and you are the aggressor. What I would do is I would move in such a way that I try to block you from seeing her. Okay, so now I'm the defender. All right, so look at two people and try to put yourself in between them so that they cannot see one another. Got it? Okay, so on the count of three, let's go. All right. Okay. All right, thank you. That's great. You passed. You can all go back to your seats now. So what you just saw happen, which is that everybody clustered in the second version of the game, happens all the time. We've played this game with a room full of CEOs. We've played it with a number of kids in Boy Scouts that were 7 years old, and it worked the same way. It has nothing to do with your cognitive powers. It has to do with the interactions between people. And it turns out that these things are not easy to predict. Now, if you say, why should we care? This is just a game. There are three reasons why I think that you should care. First, I've just shown you a very simple system that can exhibit unexpected emergent behaviors. Second, I've shown you that even if you know what every agent is doing, it's very difficult to predict what the system will do as a whole. And third, and perhaps most important, I made a very, very slight change in one of the rules, and the behavior of the system changed dramatically. So each of you was doing basically the same thing, but the system behaved very differently. So now suppose that you are the WWF, and you have 6 areas of conservation that you care about. And you're trying to change worlds. You're trying to change nutrition up in northern Canada. How likely is it that the interventions that you design are actually going to succeed, and that the things that you expect will happen will really happen? Interestingly, on the website of this symposium, there is a short video that has the following question. How can conservation shift to keep up with a rapidly changing world? I would argue that that question needs to be expanded to ask, how can conservation shift in order to achieve desirable outcomes? Because we don't want to just change the world. We don't want to just respond to changes in the world. We want to have desirable outcomes. So I actually added a slide. I cheated. I just added a slide because I heard Rebecca Shaw make a comment, and I'm kind of quoting it, maybe not exactly word by word, right? We need different technologies if we want to solve complex problems in conservation. And I'm going to tell you in a few minutes about a technology called agent-based simulation. It's one of the tools in the arsenal of the complexity scientist. And it's something that I've been fortunate to work with for more than 20 years now in a number of applications. So I care about actually solving real problems. The agent-based modeling paradigm or simulation is very simple. You literally simulate individual people. So you change the focus from a system level, top-down, to an individual level, bottom-up. And you actually have rules for each of the agents and how they behave. You have interactions, and those interactions between the agents, the environment, and one another ultimately influence the behavior of the system so that the system behavior emerges just like it does in the real world. And I'm going to wrap up by showing you 2 examples. One of them is going to be very close to the topics that we all care about, and that has to do with sustainability. In particular, Ecosystem, about maybe 4 years ago, did a project with the Rockefeller Foundation. They were interested as part of the program on oceans and fisheries, they were interested in understanding how their initiatives can impact the sustainability of fisheries. And we looked in particular at a fishery in the island of Mindoro, which is one of the islands in the Philippines. It's a really complex ecosystem that involves the fishermen, the fish stock, and we heard a lot of these examples earlier. Dan talked about it, Linda talked about it, the idea that there are these connected ecosystems. What we ended up doing is that we did an extensive study and then built a computer simulation. And as a matter of fact, that computer simulation is still available online. And if you go to, I think the address is up there, fisheries.ecosystem.com, it looks like a dashboard, but behind it, there is actually a simulation that captures the kinds of interactions that we've seen in a number of the diagrams that prior speakers have given us. And through that, you can change what you want to do. It's like you're playing a little game, right? You change the initiatives that you want to implement, and the simulation calculates all of the interactions and simulates it out for a certain number of years. And then it shows you how much am I going to impact things like fish stock. Well, in this particular case, whatever it is that we did had a small decrease. So a single red arrow down means that there's a small decrease in the fish stock. But on the other hand, whatever we did had a large increase on municipal fisher per capita surplus. And of course, there are many constraints and many possible things that you care about. I want to finish out by telling you about another application that I've been working on, which has been taking up all of my life for the last several years now, the last 3 years or so. And that is what I call the complexity of diversity and inclusion. I became interested because a lot of the work that I've done has been related to managing workforce. And then maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I had the fortune of doing a project with the Kellogg Foundation in which we looked at how disconnected young adults from inner cities can gain employment in a way that is not just a dead-end job, but that actually will lead to a career. And in doing that project, I was actually exposed to some of these people from inner cities, and it was an amazing experience. And being a foreigner, I was born in a different country, I have a daughter, you know, the usual story. I'd been really interested in diversity, but only as a passive observer. And about 3 years ago, I had a light bulb moment, and I thought, I can do something about it. So what I've been able to do is to build computer simulations that capture the behaviors of individuals, in this case within a company, but it could be done more generally within society, to understand how inclusion in particular, meaning how the factors that make you feel welcome within an organization can potentially impact your ability to succeed, and in turn, how that impacts the success of the company. In other words, we're using complexity science to help companies understand how to make more money while making their employees happier. And if we can achieve that, it's nirvana. It's a huge business problem, and it's a huge societal problem. Let me show you what that looks like. This is a very simple simulation that has a company with 4 layers that goes from entry level up to executives. So entry level, manager, VPs, and executives. We assume that there are just 2 people, let's call them men and women, but in principle, we can put as much diversity as we care about. But we wanted to focus on one particular issue, which had to do with gender inequalities. And when I click this button, you will see the simulation where people move around, and then some of them get promoted, some of them quit or leave, and the company grows over time. And when I run this simulation for the equivalent of about 5 years, you find that the company stays balanced. So here is what the company looks like 5 years later. There is randomness. I can run this 20 times, and it will always look more or less the same. What happens now if there is gender bias in the way that people are promoted? In the version that you just saw, the way that people get promoted is that whenever there is a vacancy at an upper level, the team will look at the lower level, find the top maybe 15% of the company of that level, and then randomly choose one person, regardless of gender. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a little bias that says that if you're male, if you're blue, your probability of getting picked is a little bit higher. It's as if your score somehow is magically higher. Let's see what happens. So I'm running the same simulation again, and you can start to see an interesting pattern emerge. And in fact, when we run lots and lots of simulations, we find that within 5 years, we get a company that looks an awful lot like we see in a lot of industries out there. And it's interesting because that bias is the same at every level, and yet you see this kind of stacking up phenomenon, where now we have almost 90% or 80% of the executive team is male and only 20% is female. Whereas at the bottom, you can get a situation where paradoxically, even though you're hiring equal numbers of men and women, more women are being stuck in the bottom ranks. We took this model and we said, well, what is everybody doing these days? Unconscious bias training. So let's do the same thing in this model. Let's start with a company that is imbalanced, and let's hire an expert to do unconscious bias training, even assuming that that works. If we remove all of the biases in the way that people are promoted, what will happen to this company in 5 years? And it turns out that, lo and behold, when you run that same simulation for 5 years, very little changes. You end up getting some improvement at the bottom levels, but it takes a really long time to fix the top. In fact, we can show, and I'll show in the next slide, that it can take more than 20 years under very reasonable assumptions about the amount of bias that you have to undo the damage that you've done in only 5 years. In fact, here's a slide. I'm working with a graduate student. This is through the academic side of my work, where we ran a simulation where we're looking, each line represents one of the levels from entry level to executives. And the farther up you go, it means the more imbalanced, the more men there are. And we run, and initially it starts at 50-50. As a result of bias, we get a much more imbalanced company. When we turn off the bias, 20 years later, we still have a significant bias in favor of men at the executive level. And this is aggregated over hundreds of simulations. So these are fairly statistically significant results. So I want to wrap up by pointing out that this kind of technology is something that I've been personally using, and my colleague Eric Bonobo, we've been using for around 20 years to solve a number of really challenging problems. And it has one very important implication. That ability to go from the individual level and retaining the integrity of the individuals, retaining the details of the individual, and yet being able to understand what happens at the system level is extremely powerful. People used to say, think globally and act locally. But fortunately, we're starting to develop tools that allow us to do something much more powerful, because now we can think locally and globally at the same time in order to ensure that we have global impact. Thank you. Oh, you don't need that.
That was excellent, Paolo. Thank you. And thank you to all the volunteers who came up. I wimped out, so bravo to all of you. Now we're at a break. We're going to break for almost an hour, and you can take lunch in the National Geographic cafeteria just across the lobby here, and take the opportunity to write your systems questions on the posters that are in the cafeteria walls, and then come back here for the restart of this session in about an hour, 1:25. So thanks.